there are some points of criticism that I think are important for us to address before we end the podcast today. Firstly, what language is the Book of Mormon written in on the golden plates?
So the book talks about, again, the words that Joseph Smith comes up with to describe it in his translation is something like a Reformed Egyptian.
Reformed Egyptian. So it's some kind of, it's like analogous to Egyptian hieroglyphics.
Not necessarily. Again, I don't want to make too many claims about exactly what this is, how this language works. I'm not a linguist. There are Latter-day Saint linguists that have definitely talked about this. But it, again, Reformed Egyptian is about as far as I can go with it.
Now, as you say, we have some descriptions about the physical characteristics of the plates. We know sort of roughly how big they were. We know like the size of the plates, and of course, we also know how much information was put on the golden plates because we have our English translation. Of course, it wasn't written in English on the plates, but we know like the amount of information. Mm-hmm. Given what we know about the size of the plates, and given that there are 269,320 words of the English Book of Mormon that Joseph Smith recited, translated, whatever.
Mm-hmm.
I've seen estimates that if you had sort of 50 to 100 plates, which seems like a reasonable estimate. I mean, would you agree that there were probably between 50 and 100 golden plates?
I actually wouldn't. You're bringing up how could all of this information had fit onto those plates?
Yes, because you're going to say that they're much thinner.
So there actually have been people who have studied this pretty in depth.
Okay.
And there are absolutely ways that it could have fit on it within the thickness of known alloys that would be used for this sort of thing.
So to be clear, like if you look at another example of a metal plate, and this is something that Trent Horn brings up in his debate to you, he mentions the metal plates of Darius, which are written in a few different languages. They're written in Old Persian, they're written in Akkadian,
mm-hmm.
They're written in some other language that I can't pronounce, Elamite, and each plate contains around 200 English words. Like in translation, we get about 200 English words per plate, right?
Mm-hmm.
There are 270,000 words in the Book of Mormon. So obviously it's a different language that we're talking about here, but if that is the kind of information density that we tend to find in these sort of symbolic languages, it is difficult to imagine how somebody would take 270,000 words and fit them onto golden plates that, like, you know, were sort of off the size described. It seems like you have to have like entire paragraphs represented by like singular symbols.
Yeah, I would say that I would dispute the number of. I would have to point you to people that have actually made videos on this. I actually have one on my channel. I don't have it off the top of my head, some of the research on this, but when you actually take the thickness of the plates and change it to the number of plates that would have been available, they were described as being as thin as like pliable paper. So they were very thin in according to the descriptions from the witnesses. And when you take into account how small the text could be made, like, it doesn't rule this out. And then there's another aspect to this that people have talked about as I think a possibility. If this is a revealed translation, there's nothing in there that can't expand certain ideas that are in the original text. Blake Ostler, who's a great scholar, Latter-day Saint scholar, has a paper about the expansion theory around the Book of Mormon, that some of this may have been expanded ideas that exist. So again, yes, I put this in the, okay, this is sort of an interesting puzzle, but I don't think that it's something that sort of comes away showing that it's impossible. I think people overstate their claim.
It would have to be an incredible document, right? And I don't know much about this. I mean, I haven't read the Book of Mormon, and I knew nothing about Mormonism until we met fairly recently in Los Angeles. So, yeah, we're sort of learning on the spot here. But as far as I understand it, like, this is just the golden plates are written accounts of the people who had fled Jerusalem, and they end up burying these plates somewhere. And so, like, the writing of the plates, isn't itself like a miraculous occurrence. This is just a people writing down in their language the events of their lives. And so if we did end up happening that if it did happen that this occurred on these incredibly thin golden plates, which we don't really find anywhere else. We find plates, but we don't find them that thin. We don't find that much information put onto that size of plates. It would have to be this like remarkable and unique set of texts at the very least, right?
To a certain degree. There again, some of the stuff that you're bringing up, I know it's been disputed because I've seen apologetics on this subject. I don't have them here, but like there are texts that are extremely small in the ancient world that they would do. Also, the thickness of the plates, you can make certain things like tumbaga that they've talked about that can be made extremely thin. It's just one of those things again that, yeah, sure, I can see why this would be a challenge, but it's one that when I stack up all the other things,
sure,
I end up in this situation where it's like, look, yeah, I have reasons to doubt, but if I'm trying to account for all of it, I also have to try and account for all these reasons that I believe. And a lot of those reasons, there is evidentiary stuff there, as I've kind of talked about, which again, people can debate and dispute, but I think that there's like ultimately like with any Christian, for example, talking about various things, there are reasons to believe, there are reasons to doubt, and I think that we have a strong case, as strong as any Christian case. And then there is sort of the effect that this has on sort of a spiritual level, right?
yeah. So I'm not gonna. I don't want to put you on the spot. And if you send me after this a link to the video that you have or other videos discussing this, I'll put it in the description, because I think this will be important to people, because it's one of it's an interesting sort of physical dispute, right? Like we can, there's things that we can learn. We can discover how ancient plates were inscribed. We can discover how thin you can realistically cut gold and it still be legible. We can discover ancient languages and how they condense information.
And just to be clear, like the plates had an appearance of gold. There's the idea that they are actually like 24 karat solid gold. That is not what we believe about that. Just
interesting. Okay, yeah, that's instructive too. I think that's useful. But I did want to ask, because I'd want to see some like really miraculous kind of evidence, and the kind of stuff you're talking about, like places being described and showing up. Given that we have this community of hundreds of thousands of people, ancient people, Nephites, living in like early America, like pre-Columbian America, for years, hundreds of thousands of people. Speaking,
I don't know that I would go that far. Again, there are some assumptions in there that people make that this group was enormously huge, right? It's kind of like with the book of Exodus, right? Like how many Israelites were there in the Sinai Peninsula? To say that there is some level of exaggeration in some of the stories, like I think that that's totally a possibility. Also, where did it happen? There's disputes about that. The reality is that we know very little about sort of ancient Mesoamerican civilization. To quote a particular scholar who, George Stewart, when he was asked by National Geographic about the ancient Mayan civilization, for example. By the way, the Maya weren't like one people. It's like a general geographic ancient group that lived. He said, we hardly know anything about the Maya. There's almost 6,000 archaeological sites, and we've dug at like 40 of them. We're just at the beginning of the archaeology in this part of the world. Edwin Barnhart reported that, they've done like less than 1% of Mesoamerica has really been studied. And in the jungle areas, like there's not much there. So I wouldn't expect that like we're going to find all of this stuff.
So to be clear, we haven't, that like none of the following, as far as I'm aware, have been found. Any archaeological evidence for these ancient civilizations living in the Americas. No inscriptions of Hebrew or anything like Reformed Egyptian anywhere in America. Like if we found a Hebrew inscription, just a single Hebrew inscription somewhere in ancient America, that would be pretty extraordinary and pretty extraordinary evidence.
There are some disputed finds that are out there on that. I'm not going to weigh in on them because I don't know enough about them. But I also know that the Book of Mormon, again, there's an assumption here that the lingua franca of the people in the Book of Mormon was some sort of Hebrew or Egyptian. That's actually not what the text indicates.
Okay.
The text itself indicates that the record keepers kept a particular language that they would use for the record keeping that was not the language of the people. And it says that the language of the people was deeply corrupted and changed over time. That's what the text actually says. It would be like if somebody came, 10,000 years from now, and they came to the Americas, and they're like, we don't find Cajuns anywhere. We just find this thing about Americans and World War II and all that, like not realizing that Cajuns were a subset group that actually came from another land in Canada and were like an ethno tradition within that culture. And I think that is the better way for people to understand it.